Great. Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new talk in the Paideia Institute public lecture series. Today, we have the great pleasure of having Ada Palmer with us. Ada Palmer is an associate professor in the history department at the University of Chicago. In her research, she focuses primarily on intellectual history and the history of ideas, particularly when it comes to the recovery and the rediscovery of classical thought in the Italian Renaissance. She is the co-author of The Recovery of Ancient Philosophy in the Renaissance, a brief guide, which she wrote together with one of my own mentors, Jim Hankins, and the book was published in 2008. Her own first monograph, Reading Lucretius in the Renaissance, was published by Harvard University Press and explores the rediscovery and reception of Lucretius's De Rerum Natura between the early 15th and the late 16th century. Among her forthcoming books, let me just mention Why We Censor and The Myth of the Renaissance, which I very much look forward to reading. But let me say that Ada has a lot of other talents too. In fact, one might be tempted to call her a Renaissance woman, no pun intended here. Besides being a scholar and historian, she's also a composer and a novelist. In fact, she's published a whole trilogy of science fiction novels called Terra Ignota. And you can read more about her various projects on her website, which is adapalmer.com. And here's the link. Today, she'll be talking about one of my favorite topics, the process of recovering a lost classic in the Renaissance. So over to you, Ada, and welcome everyone.
Excellent, and thank you so many delightful people, some friends and some new friends, for joining me this morning. I have the good luck of being in quarantine with my rare books teaching collection, which is a collection of materials that I have assembled over the years through the expedient of when I'm in unusual cities, such as Bergamo or Brussels or whatever, walking into bookshops and asking, do you have any old Renaissance books in terrible condition that collectors would never want to buy because they're falling apart and have broken open spines and are unimportant editions and single leaves by themselves? And they, after the pause of such a surprising question, always say, yes, I do, and are excited to find a home for these materials, because when you're teaching, sort of the more broken something is, the better. It lets you see the guts of the book and the way it's put together. So I've assembled this collection, which I use as an orientation collection for graduate students that are starting on rare books work, but that are also very useful for talking about the process of recovery of a classic. The format that I like for this type of thing is what I like to call interruptible lecture, where I will talk, but I will also keep an eye on the chat within the Zoom window. And so when there are questions, I will see them and I will work them into the fabric of what I discuss. So when you have questions as I'm moving along, please do share them in the chat and they will integrate. I believe, yes, this talk is being recorded to be published on YouTube, which is a very good thing because I have been looking forward to getting to share this kind of material in a more public way. So I'm going to talk about the process of a classical text being transformed repeatedly over the centuries after antiquity until it lands on the bookshelf of young Voltaire, young Diderot, young D'Holbach in the Enlightenment, and indeed young Thomas Jefferson, young George Washington. There are many stages of that transformation. And we sometimes talk about rediscovery, but I usually use the word transformation or recovery because it's a bit more helpful in understanding that we aren't talking about Indiana Jones going out and digging a hole and finding a text. That happens in modernity when we dig in Herculaneum. We do find lost scrolls and then scan them with ultraviolet. But the Renaissance process and the process by which these materials get to us is a process of the books constantly being known, being in a collection somewhere. But the form they take, the apparatus that people surround them with of commentary or notes or translation, the format of the book, and the understood purpose of the text, what this is for in the eyes of the society that has it, changes over time. And each of those stages and each of those changes is key to the classics arriving, when they do, to whom they do, and also which classics arrive. And so by talking about the transformation of the format of books over the course of that and showing you some editions, most of them will be Lucretius, which is one of the texts that I trace most in its transformation. We'll look at what shapes which classics we have, when they get studied, how much and to what extent they get celebrated at any given time. The most important thing to understand at the beginning is papyrus. So this is a modern sheet of papyrus. There are no ancient sheets of papyrus available for somebody with a small bank account to own. You can see the plaid texture. I hope that's in focus. Let me double check that it is. It's not, but I can make it be in focus. Give me a few seconds. There we go. You can see that there is a plaid or striped texture to the surface. Papyrus is a sticky, fibrous water plant. Think of asparagus. And you slice it the long way so that you have lots of long, thin canes or ribbons, flat ribbons of the papyrus. And you set a bunch of them in parallel, in rows, on a rock or on a flat surface. And then you set another set of them perpendicular so that you have one set of papyrus strips going this way and the other going this way. You don't weave them. You just set them next to each other and on top of each other. But because the sap is sticky, as it dries, they adhere to each other and they create this nice sheet with comparatively little labor, making this an inexpensive writing surface. It's not as cheap as using a wax tablet or a disposable thing, but it is comparatively very inexpensive for the production of a writing surface in the pre-modern world. In contrast with its constant rival companion, parchment. Looking up close, this is a 17th century letter on parchment. So this is animal skin. This letter is in extremely difficult to read Italian. I recommend not trying. But what we're looking at is the surface itself. One thing you will notice is that this side is quite white, and this side is much yellower. This is a case of cheap, bad quality parchment, which makes it more helpful. And do you see how there's a faint speckled texture to the surface? Those are the hair follicles of the sheep, because this is the skin of a sheep. And all parchment has a outside side that has the speckle of the hair follicles, and then an inside side that is usually cleaner. They work hard with bleaches to try to get it to be white on both sides, and I will show you a much better quality piece of parchment in a moment. That is not the parchment. That is a piece of Coptic linen. Here it is. I always wrap this one up carefully because it would be so easy to lose. Page from a book of hours. So this is from a tiny, as you can see by the scale of my hand, medieval prayer book, or Renaissance in this case. This is circa 1480s. And this is also thin, paper thin as it looks. This is also animal skin. And you can again see the speckle of the hair follicles on this side and the absence of that speckle on the clean side, even though both of them in this case are very, very white. You'll also notice on this particular sheet that there is a hole and that they wrote around the hole. See how the words sort of squunch themselves in on the left of the hole and there's nothing on the right? That hole didn't come about after this page was written on. That hole was already there. But parchment is so expensive the skin of a sheep very painstakingly stretched, that when holes like that develop in the parchment, they don't throw it away. They just write around it. Sometimes they stitch it shut. Sometimes they paint over it to make it into part of a decorative detail. But it gives you a sense that a book on parchment was a very expensive undertaking. I mean, a leather jacket is comparatively expensive even in our own affluent days. And to give you a sense of the scale of the expense, a book on parchment around 1300, right before the accelerations of the Renaissance, a book on parchment around 1300 costs as much as a house. And a little pocket paperback equivalent costs as much as a studio condo in a basement somewhere, and a big fancy bejeweled decorated giant Aristotle or giant theological text costs as much as a 8-bedroom mansion might. But that's the scale of investment you're talking about for the production of books on parchment, books on vellum. You've heard the term vellum. Vellum is a great confusing term. Some people use it synonymously with parchment. Technically, vellum is the best quality parchment, meaning parchment made from the skin of an aborted fetal cow, because it's never grown its fur, so there aren't any of those speckles, and it makes the softest and most pliable wool. But almost all parchment that we've analyzed the DNA of that claimed to be vellum turns out to secretly not be vellum in one way or another. And almost all vellum, even when vellum was widely in use, was fake vellum because it was so expensive to produce, and also therefore so cost effective to pretend that this was vellum, but it's really a sheep or whatever it is. So vellum is almost never actually vellum, making it much more broadly a term for high quality parchment, et cetera, or sometimes just a synonym for parchment. People often ask about handling the stuff with one's bare hands as opposed to gloves. And the answer is that almost all rare books libraries don't use gloves anymore because they reduce your manual dexterity, and they make it much more likely that you'll accidentally rip or damage the object because you're clumsy with the addition of fabric over your fingers. Gloves are used for things that are chemically sensitive. They're used if you're handling a 17th century globe, where the glue that holds the paper or parchment surface to the wooden ball is chemically sensitive, and the oils of your hands can affect it. You wear gloves when you're handling illuminations, the decorative script, etc., that is made with very chemically sensitive inks or with dangerous inks that are full of lead and mercury and things that you don't want to be handling. For those kinds of materials, there's an amazing Erasmus where an entire page was inked out with extremely poisonous bright red ink by the Inquisition that a number of censorship scholar friends of mine were buzzing about when it turned up a few years ago. And for those, you wear gloves for your own protection. People often also ask, how fragile is it? How careful do I have to be handling the object? And what I always tell students who are the most nervous about this is when you're handling a rare book, pretend you're holding your friend's pet hamster or your friend's pet parakeet. You don't want to squeeze it. You don't want to hurl it. You don't want to wrench it. You don't want to do anything that's going to startle it, but it knows how to take care of itself, and you're going to be fine. They are very, very well made, and they are usually in much stronger, better condition than later books. The more fragile books are the books from after the 1840s, when we invented acid-based wood pulp paper, because that's what gets all brown and brittle and falling apart. And friends who work with brittle books, one of whom is sitting over there quarantining with me, will tell you that the really fragile stuff, the stuff that shatters if you breathe on it, are magazines from the 30s, newspapers from 1900, newspapers from during World War I and World War II, old medical textbooks that were produced on the cheapest quality acidic paper. And these are the things that fall apart. This stuff is designed to last for many, many years. Parchment, we don't know how long parchment lasts. It lasts longer than from when we invented parchment several centuries BC until now. This is why the British Parliament kept its records on parchment until just a couple of years ago, because British Parliament really, really wants their records to last forever. And paper was only invented, 1 millennium ago. Actually a millennium and a half, but do you trust a material so young with your records that you want to last forever? Parchment, we know, lasts an incredibly long time. And these things are hand stitched together. So to give you a sense of the sturdiness, a decade or two ago, I think it's 2 now, a man tried to steal the Gutenberg Bible from Harvard's Houghton Library. And jumped out a 3rd floor window with it while evading people, and fell on it, and it broke his fall, and it was fine. It just has a small gash in the cover. He broke his leg, but the Gutenberg was fine. And this, where is it? I have one of these that fell down an elevator shaft and was fine. It's Alden Lucretius. It's here somewhere. When I run across it in the course of the presentation, I will tell you, this is the one that fell down an elevator shaft, and you'll never tell, because they are quite sturdy. Unlike papyrus, and that is key to the problem of what we do and don't have from antiquity, because papyrus is very brittle. It's much less flexible and forgiving than parchment or paper. If you look closely, I don't know how closely you can see it, but this piece of papyrus is only 5 years old, and it's already ripping at the corner where it's folded. Papyrus is very bad at being folded to make the pages of a codex. This is a reconstruction of an early style codex, the codex being first developed by Coptic peoples in early late antiquity, if you will forgive the term. But a papyrus scroll will last a long time. Trying to make papyrus into the far more space efficient structure of a codex book, where you have quires of paper that are folded over together, one quire being one set of folded pages and then stitched together along the spine onto these cables. You can see the hand stitching. This is a far more efficient, durable, and space-friendly way to structure a book. But papyrus just can't do it. It's very difficult. There are papyrus codices, but they really shatter. Whereas paper codices, even if, like this example, they lose their spine cover. So this is a 17th century pocket Petrarch, the Italian poetry of Petrarch. And it has long since lost the cardboard spine. I'll show you the lovely frontispiece with the lovely imaginary portrait of Laura. This has long since lost its spine cover so that we can see the stitch work on the spine of what is a real period book and not a reconstructed book. But it nonetheless has held together for probably at least 100 years since losing the spine. Papyrus doesn't last that long. It has a maximum lifespan before it decays of maybe 400 to 600 years. The papyrus that we have surviving from antiquity survived because of exceptional preservation circumstances. Often it was in a mummy or in a tomb or in a just correct pH, very stable humidity place where it got buried. And even then it'll be brown and it'll be worn away at the edges. Papyrus, and you may think, 600 years, that's a long time-ish. But it's not a long time when we hit the very important event and the most important unconscious censorship that has happened in the Western tradition, which comes between and around the 4th to 6th centuries AD. Because when Rome has freshly fallen and the infrastructure of the empire has freshly disappeared, that means trade across the Mediterranean is no longer safe. There are now pirates in the Mediterranean that make it very difficult for ships to travel. The papyrus, which is a water plant and needs heat, and humidity, is grown in Egypt and somewhat in Sicily, but mainly in Egypt. So when the empire's trade networks are disrupted, Western Europe loses access to papyrus. You can no longer get the means to make a cheap book. You can only get the parchment, which makes one book cost as much as a house. And it's in that phase from the 4th century to the 6th century AD that the ancient papyrus books they have are decaying. They have lots and lots of books in Western Europe before this point, but they are decaying and they need to be transcribed onto new surfaces. They need to have new copies. Western Europe can't afford that much parchment. It just can't. It's in a state of impoverishment compared to the rest of the world at that point. So they have to prioritize. What do we save? We can't save it all. What do we save? And most of the copying that is done is being done in monasteries. Why? Because Saint Benedict, who establishes the rules for monks, and other figures who establish the rules for monks, think that being learned is important for monks. And one of the rules for a monk is you must read a new book every year, which was not difficult when papyrus was cheap and libraries were plentiful in antiquity. But when you hit the Middle Ages and you've got a monk and he might live to his 80s, your monastery has to have 60 books, which is an investment on the scale of building 60 houses. So monasteries put a lot of money and get money from patrons and donors and pious people and kings to produce these libraries, which they are mandated to have, and copy over text. So most of the copying is done by monks. Monks decide which books are the highest priority. This is why we have more books by St. Augustine than the entirety of all classical Latin, because monks prioritized what monks cared about. It's not that they wanted to destroy earlier things for the most part, but when you can only save a quarter of the books, there is an act of unconscious censorship in the sorting process of which books you save. Thus, the majority of what antiquity had that we don't is lost between the 4th and 6th centuries AD as the papyrus decays. What survives was copied by monks in a script not unlike this, though this one is a page from a prayer book and is very decorated, onto parchment. So skin of a dead sheep. This is a folio-sized one. So this is one sheep's worth of text page. And those last for ages. They'll last another millennium past where we are now, at least. They last and last and last, and the monasteries have them. But the question is, what do other people think about them, and do they bother to read them? Most of the classics are surviving in one of two places, either A, monastery libraries, or B, the Middle East, where they never lost papyrus, where they never had this crash, where they never lost the infrastructure, where the Roman Empire, which for them means the Byzantine Empire, lasts until the mid-1400s, and there is never this crash. They retain a huge portion of the classics. The West, in this sorting process, loses the vast majority of them. But they still have some, and they're on the library shelves in monasteries, and some monks are reading them. But there isn't a lot of perceived utility to them, other than moral edification, Virgil's tales of heroic leadership and empire, and which people think are supposed to teach you about politics. They also have this idea that Virgil was a divinely inspired sage, because in his Eclogues and Georgics, there's one, he talks about the coming of a great prophesied person who will save the empire. Classicists today believe that he meant Marcellus, the adopted son of Augustus, grandson of Augustus, who that this is flattery to Augustus, but it's interpreted by medieval people as prophesying the coming of Christ. So they're reading that for moral edification. They're reading Ovid to learn vocabulary and to learn about the, don't stand up against the gods, hubris stories that they take out of the Metamorphoses. But beyond that, there isn't a lot of perceived utility to this, largely because the focus of medieval scholarship and learning, for the most part, is understanding the nature of God and the nature of heaven. This is perfectly rational. If in your society, the fundamental nature of your science is there's one omnipotent, enormous cause of everything that made everything, all things are part of that being's plan, and that being has ultimate power over you, your country, and everything else. Are you going to study that thing, or are you going to study anything else? The study of everything else is considered less important, because if you want to understand the nature of trees, understanding the nature of God who made them is going to be more effective than looking at the actual trees. This is perfectly rational within a medieval worldview. And so the utility of scholarship, the scholarship that gets wealthy kings to invest in it, is when scholars can say, hey, I can teach you to understand the nature of God better so that you can do things that will make him bless your country more, so your country will be more politically successful. And kings say, that's great. Have enough money to make a copy of a book that costs as much as a house. Scholarship, when books are that expensive, doesn't happen unless the people with wealth and power believe that it has political utility. The transformation then begins in the mid-1300s with Petrarch, and a circle of scholars around Petrarch who, in a kinder history, would be as famous and well-known as Petrarch. But 1348, Black Death sweeps through, almost all of them died. And Petrarch is the survivor of a collective of classical scholars who were trying to develop new forms of republican government out of Cicero and other wonderful things. But he, preserving the ideas of his lost friends, looks around Italy, looks around Europe as he knows it, and he sees a terrible situation. He sees nearly constant war and faction fighting. Remember that Shakespeare's Montagues and Capulets in Romeo and Juliet is inspired by truth. It's not fully fiction. The ferocity of the faction fighting in Renaissance Italy is almost impossible to believe. Someone like Petrarch will live through multiple instances of literally seeing the streets run with blood. Florence's law code had to ban building buildings above a certain height because people would build tall buildings and then set fire to the town around them to watch their enemies' houses burn while they stayed safe in their tall towers. This happened enough that they had to make laws about it. And Northern Italy in particular, which is the place that Petrarch is most concerned by, was ravaged by the political isolation of these individual little city-states, which were perpetually unable to unify with neighbors for a variety of factors. I have a lecture on this. If you're interested, email me and I'll send you the audio. But Petrarch proposes in this moment of perceiving his era to be, as he describes it, an age of dust and ashes. Parenthesis, yes, this is the birth of the idea of the Middle Ages or Dark Age that will come to dominate our ideas of history. Petrarch is the beginning of the idea of maligning this period that comes after antiquity. He says the solution is to look backwards. He says the solution is Rome, to try to match the art and achievements of the ancients. He isn't thinking, as we often do when we think of antiquity, of the scandalous Caesars and Tiberius and Caligula and Caracalla having a friend say he was so hungry he could eat a whale and ordering his men to catch a whale and weigh it and force the guy to eat that much seafood. What's in Petrarch's mind is the Pax Romana, peace, and especially stability and the safety of the Roman roads. right? In antiquity under Augustus, and in fact for many emperors after him, there was such stability that there were no pirates in the Mediterranean. There have never been no pirates in the Mediterranean at any other point. There are pirates in the Mediterranean now, which, by the way, were causing enormous problems during the blockage of the Suez Canal. There were safe roads. As a medieval king put it, true power is when a young woman with a bag of gold can walk by herself in safety from one end of your country to the other. Not glorious castles, not great armies. When a citizen can walk across your country without fear, that is power. And in the mind of Petrarch, the idea that that ever happened, in the mind of a Europe where so many technologies have been lost, not because you can't understand how they were done, but because you can't get the materials to do that. You can't make high quality steel when you can't get the imported ingredients to make the steel. You can't make Roman clear glass when you can't import the sand that becomes clear glass because there aren't roads. The loss of technology is actually a loss of transportation for the most part. And Petrarch, just after the Black Death had eased up and people were starting to write and discover which of their friends were still alive, two friends who survived, scholar friends, wrote to him and said, Petrarch, we're alive. We're going to come visit you. And as he was eagerly waiting for them to arrive, they were attacked by bandits on the road. And one of them was killed and the other one was wounded and driven into hiding for several months. So the problem is very real, and the dream of peace, the dream of being able to walk in safety from one city to another, that is the magic of Rome. And so says Petrarch, we need to reconstruct the lost arts of the ancients, not just the aqueducts and the metallurgy and the geometry, which we in modernity are so excited about them recovering. The educational system. What Petrarch wants is the library that raised young Cicero, the library that raised young Seneca, the library that raised the Roman Brutus, who, when his own sons conspired to take over the state and make him king, had them executed for treason. That story sounds impossible to Petrarch in an age of Montagues and Capulets, when many, many powerful families will happily make war against the state rather than let young Romeo suffer the legal consequences of his own murder. That's what Petrarch says we need. We need to raise the next generation of our elite leadership. This is not a universalist democratic movement. It is the beginning of universal education. I'll talk about that, but it is not there yet. We need to raise our elites, our leaders, our merchant princes, our great families, the daughters and sons of the rulers of our city-states, whether they are kings or great bank empire heads. We want to raise them on the books that raised Cicero. And if we do that, he says, they will be better leaders, and they will be more loyal leaders, and they will do things like Cicero did, where they put the good of the state before the good of family. And then we will have safe roads. And that dream is what gets rich people to invest the equivalent of millions in the assembly of these libraries. It's what gets Pope Nicholas V to invest in sending scholars like Giovanni Arispa all the way to Constantinople to get a hold of books and learn Greek and bring Greek back so that they can read Greek. In Petrarch's age, they don't have Greek yet. There's an amazing letter he writes to Homer, because Petrarch had the Iliad. He had it in his hand, and he couldn't read it. And he didn't know if anyone else ever would, because it survived, but access to the language didn't. But within his lifetime, scholars made it to Constantinople and married Greek women who helped them learn Greek, and got a hold of Greek texts and learned some Greek and produced terrible awful translations of Homer that sound like a second-year language student doing an extremely pedantic literalist, and the words are all in the same order translation that kind of vaguely gets across the meaning, but no beauty. Because it takes a long time to get really good at a language when you haven't had it at all, especially when the only teachers of ancient Greek that were around were native speakers of modern Greek. So imagine if somebody came to you and you were used to teaching Shakespeare and said, okay, now we want you to teach Shakespeare to these people who speak only Finnish. You're not used to, it's not just that you need to learn to speak Finnish. You're not used to explaining the language of Shakespeare to someone who doesn't already understand modern English. They aren't used to teaching Greek to people who don't understand modern Greek already. So the production of the printed editions, which are flourishing by the 15 teens, remember Petrarch is late 1300s, so we have 2 centuries or a century and a half lapping over both sides of the 1400s to get from we are tromping through the Alps to go to distant monasteries to look for these books to we have 30 editions of something as obscure as Lucretius. That is enabled by convincing wealthy elites that this education will make their rulers, their children, more effective rulers. Oh no, I took the bookmark out and lost. Okay, there it is. So one thing I want to show you, and then we'll jump back into the chronology, but this is just super fun. I need my zoom again. Here on the right is some text in Greek. Actually, the left is as well. And even if you know the Greek alphabet, it is full of marks that you've never ever seen, and you could not actually interpret this. Those are ligatures. They're imitating the handwriting of the Greek scribes from Constantinople who have taught them Greek. So you know how AE is sometimes a ligature connected together, and you sometimes in older English books see CT connected together. Or there's that character in German that looks like a giant wiggly bee. It is actually the double S. So this is an enormous range of extremely difficult for us to interpret ligatures that make the Greek slightly more compact. It squeezes 2 letters into one. That's why they're using it, because they're used to a situation where every page is a dead sheep. And every time you can compress the information a little bit to have fewer pages, you save that much money. You say, but then why do they have enormous margins? Because they expect you to use this book forever. Because they expect first that it will be water damaged and damaged in a variety of ways over centuries of use and reuse. So they want to give it that buffer because they are future-proofing this investment. This is not an investment for one generation. It is an investment for many generations. But also so that you can write in the margins, so that you can add commentary with the expectation that many, many people will use this individual copy of the book over centuries. Making a handwritten improvement to this one copy will benefit many dozens of people. That is characteristic of manuscript culture and continues into early print culture. But as printing, and I will talk about the origins of printing in a moment, as printing multiplies, people start to realize, wait, actually, this edition of Lucretius, there's going to be a better edition of Lucretius by the time my son or daughter needs Lucretius. Me correcting this one and making notes in it isn't necessarily that helpful. They'll buy a better one. Annotation begins to die out and become less common, and the large margins intended for it shrink away a little bit as well, as printing becomes the dominant form and as people start to realize that books are not going to be used forever. Books are going to be used for their generation, and a new, better version of that book will likely replace it afterward. So we've gotten as far as Petrarch convincing the wealthy elites of Europe that they should invest in libraries. And they do. Some of them bankrupt themselves doing it, but they do. And in 1300, when, as I said, a book costs as much as a house, the largest library in Europe, much bigger ones exist elsewhere, but the largest library in Europe is the Great University Library of Paris. which has 600 books. There's no kiosk selling books in an airport today that doesn't have more than 600 books, but in 1300, that is the bar. By 1410, 1420, book collectors who were friends of Petrarch and inspired by this project of healing Europe by raising a better ruling class by giving them the ethics of Cicero, have assembled libraries of over 1,000 or as many as 1,500 books. And it's in the mid-1400s that we see a surge of foundation of great libraries. The Vatican Library is founded at that point. The Lawrenciano Library, founded by the Medici in Florence, is founded like that. Cesena's library, the first library formally open to the public, not just to the friends of the elite, is founded in that period as well. And they begin to assemble manuscripts in large quantities. And suddenly having a library is not just something monks need. It's something ambassadors need. It's something kings need. It's something that makes your kingdom seem powerful. It's something that displays the strength of your nation. It becomes a field for political competition. Libraries start being built, as the Venetian Marciana is, right where the ambassadors land in the port, right opposite the Doge's palace in San Marco, right in the seat of power to show off we have not only the strength of St. Mark and the strength of our ferocious government, but also knowledge, which people are beginning to equate with power in the political sense. That drill drives library building, large-scale library building when a city wants to have 1,500 books, and small-scale library building when an ambitious young son of a banker, of a low-status bank clerk who wants to make something of himself and get an education and go to court and help his country feels like therefore he needs to own 4 or 5 books, which is enough money to own 4 or 5 houses. That is very difficult. Gutenberg doesn't invent the movable type press in 1450 out of nowhere. He invents it because the demand for manuscripts had just skyrocketed, and the number of people who wanted to buy them had gone way up. And so people were working hard on first woodblock printing and then his printing press. It met a need, and it revolutionized the cost of books because here are good numbers. In 1478, I think it is. It might have been in the 80s, actually. Yes, it's got to be 1480s. When Ficino, Florentine scholar funded by the Medici, finally finished his complete translation of Plato, and the Medici funded printing it, it cost 300 florins, which is a gentleman's income for a year. This is a period when a school teacher's income for a year is 20 to 25 florins. It costs 300 florins to print 300 copies with a printing press, and another 300 florins to produce 1 illuminated manuscript copy. To give you a sense of how much cheaper these books are, so that by the time it is the 1480s and printing has been going on for a couple of decades, a school teacher's salary for a year is about 20 florins. A book printed by Aldus Manutius, this book specifically, costs a school teacher's salary for 1 month, not for several years, for 1 month. And that is a revolutionary change. This, by the way, is a modern binding because this book lost its period binding, but it's a modern reconstruction of a period binding. And you can see that it is a lot whiter than these yellowed ones. This is animal skin. It would have been this white in all likelihood at the beginning. Aldus Manutius, who after Gutenberg, many credit as the most important figure in early printing, developed the brilliant idea of making small, portable books, ones that affordably a scholar can have a few of, that are all the same size and format, that don't have giant commentaries around them. The earliest printed books are all huge. but that you can carry in your pocket and read and collect. They were originally sold as naked pages without binding. And you yourself take the book to the binder to have it bound. And if you're a poor scholar, you have it bound in a very plain binding like these. This is the 1515 Alden edition of Lucretius, the first paperback, we can say, of Lucretius. And if you're wealthier, then you have it bound in a much fancier tooled leather binding, perhaps, with patterns and maybe your coat of arms on it. This is the 1512 Lucretius, and gives you the sense of what I mean when it's a revolution that Aldus starts printing. Oh, it's upside down. It's heavy to even lift the puppy. When Aldus has the revolutionary idea of printing small ones. Notice how big this is compared to my hand, but also this is the text of Lucretius. All of this and all of this is commentary. And indeed, the commentary is useful, and libraries with big, heavy books like this chained to the desk remain major, and these big, hefty commentaries. This is the 1512 Lucretius commentary by Antoninus Pius. No, Albertus Pius. Here's the lovely title page in which printing is so excitingly new that they're showing the printers on the front. 1512, printing has existed for 65 years. You may be thinking 65 years after computers came in, they were no longer exciting and new. But printing spreads exponentially, which means Gutenberg has one press. He teaches 3 guys to make a press. A year, 2 years later, there are 4 presses. It takes another couple of years for there to be 8 presses. Another couple of years for there to be 16 presses. And you know that puzzle where you have a chessboard and there's 1 penny on the first square, and then 2, and then 4, and then 8. And yes, you have trillions of dollars by the time you get to the far end of the chessboard, but the first row is pretty slow. Printing spreads exponentially, so that at the beginning, the growth is quite slow, and it's really in the 15 teens that it's gaining a lot of momentum. It's in the 1550s that 14 teens, 15th century, 14 teens that I'm right, 15 teens. Numbers are hard. That this 1514 has been written in, that this edition is still excited by printing, which is still uncommon. And it's not until the 1490s that the very first of these little paperbacks, this is another early Lucretius. Notice how this has, this isn't Lucretius, what is this? Oh yes, this is, has the Aldus in the front. Notice how these two are about the same format with very, very similar script. Sorry, I said this was Alden before. This is the 1515 Alden. This is the 1512 Juntine because he leapt in, and Aldus in his series hadn't gotten around to doing the Lucretius yet. And so he was able to undercut by making a version that matched. So if you already had the Cicero, imagine if you're collecting your Loeb classics or your Penguin classics, and before Penguin gets around to putting out the Lucretius volume, someone else puts out one that matches it exactly, has the same font and the same format. And since you're getting the bindings made yourself, it's just as easy to get this one bound to match your set as this one. Economic competition being one of the early plagues of printing until there is some form of copyright enforcement, but then that turns into censorship instantly. So 1300s, late 1300s, Petrarch convinces people they need to assemble libraries. Lots of increase in manuscript production in the first half of the 1400s. 1450, Gutenberg develops the printing press because of demand. Although he himself doesn't have a distribution mechanism for the books because he's in landlocked Germany, so he goes bankrupt because, there are Congratulations, Mr. Gutenberg. You have printed 300 Bibles for the cost of one Bible. There are 5 people in your small German town who legally can read the Bible when you're not allowed to read it if you're not a priest. You now have 295 Bibles. What are you going to do next? He goes bankrupt because there's no way to sell them. By the 1480s, 1490s, Aldus and his peers start printing in Venice. A bunch of Gutenberg's apprentices run away from their debts, flee Germany, go to Venice, marry people, and teach them how to make printing presses. They can print 300 copies of a Bible and sell 5 of them to each of nearly 100 different ship's captains, who will each go from Venice, the Midway Airport transportation hub where you change boats of the period, and take those to 60 different cities where there will be, to 60 different cities where there will be buyers for 5 copies, 3 copies in each city. That is when printing becomes viably economically profitable. That's the 1480s through 15 teens. Printing then disseminates and starts being present in more and more cities later on, and the format of the classics transforms. So it had been expensive vellum pages, very bulky commentary editions, which, some of the medieval copies are giant commentary editions like this. Some of the commentaries like this are made just from older manuscripts, which were more plain. And then those give way to these affordable classics that have the bare text. But with time, that gives way to another thing, the text with help. Portable, and yet it has notes on the unusual vocabulary. Portable and yet, come on, focus. Portable and yet full of, in this case, the kinds of little notes you're used to seeing in a modern Loeb classic. Little marginal notes here giving the readings of variant versions of that word that different scholars, when editing the text, have proposed over time. Over here, giving a subject heading based on a set of medieval manuscript subject headings that are probably copied from late antique ones. And it even has appendices. So this is Lucretius, but I showed you in this copy that there's also Greek. This is an excerpt describing the ancient plague in Athens, which Lucretius also talks about. An excerpt from, I forget who. This one in this section is Epicurus's letters excerpted from Diogenes Laertius. There's also the plague in Athens later. And look, there's also an index with vocabulary notes to help you with Lucretius's unusual and difficult material, so that the essential elements of a commentary that aid reading have been compressed into a pocket edition that is still affordable for a school teacher and that you can carry and use. They sometimes push the maximum of this. This is one of the silliest of all editions of Lucretius in the period. This is the effort to compress Denis Lambin's 300,000 word Lucretius commentary into a paperback, which is barely able to open. The commentary is published in 1563. This is the 1580 effort to try to compress the whole thing. So you can see it's still mostly commentary. Here's the text of Lucretius surrounded by the masses of commentary. Denis Lambin, by the way, is the source of the French verb lambiner, to go on at excessive length about something. And his commentary on Lucretius is almost entirely about how everywhere Lucretius is wrong, Aristotle is right, and here's what Aristotle would say. But it is a very neat moment to see that they're trying to make even this by the 1580s. They're trying to make even a massive commentary be in a format that a scholar can carry. So the important part of this, I know I'm just about out of time, is more readers can read each of these. Very few people can read the script in a surviving ancient page. Only expert scholars really can. I don't have an actual ancient page here, but if you remember that 17th century letter with its extremely difficult script, very few people can make that out. And the ones who do figure out what the Latin says, very few of them are equipped to read and understand it. So it takes a long time to sit with something like this. And there are maybe a dozen scholars in 1430 who have the patience and the expertise to sit with this kind of medieval manuscript and understand it. That era's Lucretius 1430 has been rediscovered. Poggio has brought it back from the monastery where it sat unlooked at for a few centuries. But there's only a dozen people who can read it. That's 1430s. By the late 1480s, 1490s, when big versions like this are being printed, few people can afford this, but now there are maybe 100, 300 people who can get a hold of the big expensive commentary or have a patron rich enough to do it. A dozen has become 300. When it gets printed in these affordable forms, 300 becomes 1,500. And when there's another edition by a rival printer, 1,500 becomes 3,000. Who can read the Latin when the Latin is made easily comprehensible? The correcting process done by the early philologists is already done. Then when a version with vocabulary aids, so that you don't have to be an expert Latinist to read Lucretius, you can have kind of the mediocre Latin of a medical student who's used to just reading contemporary medical textbooks and struggles with Lucretius's poetry and with Lucretius's ancient and archaic vocabulary, but you have these nice aids to help you. Now the number of people who can read Lucretius is multiplied from 3,000 to 30,000, not just because there are 30,000 copies by 1600, but because the copies themselves have made the text approachable by less expert people. In my dissertation work, I looked at hundreds of copies of Lucretius from all of these periods, from right after its rediscovery in the 1430s, from the 1450s, from the 1480s and 90s, from the 15 teens, from the 1550s, from the 1580s. And the annotation in the margins, the comments people make in the margins change. Where's my little Cicero? I don't own an animated, oh, that's the one that fell down an elevator shaft, but I'm looking for the Cicero. I don't own an annotated Lucretius, but the annotations in a textbook copy like this is a classroom Cicero, and it'll be full of notes. But the notes change with what decade the book was produced and what decade the notes were made. The early notes, almost all philology. What is this participle? How does it work? They're trying to figure out the passive periphrastic. They're trying to figure out the supine. They're trying to figure out the difficult grammar that medieval Latin hadn't used. Because medieval Latin, you know how when you're doing Latin and you learn how to say because, and that there are 5 different ways to say because, and one of them is like ut, and one of them is, using a strange participle, and some of them need the subjunctive, or you can just use a quod clause, and you're like, quod clause is way easier than all the other ones. And then you have a prose comp assignment, and you're like, I could just use the quod clause. I probably shouldn't, because my teacher will think I'm taking the easy way out, but it would be much easier than using the subjunctive and all this stuff. So medieval Latin is, they use the quod clause all the time. Medieval Latin is, they do the easiest version of the grammar. And so they have to, in the Renaissance, refigure out the weird subjunctives and paraphrastics and supines. And that's what the early annotation always is. The later annotation will be like this schoolboy annotation who's writing down the vocabulary that's new to him so that he can remember it later, or writing down the key terms so he can remember the content. That's what you get in the 15 teens. That's what you get in the 1550s. In the 1560s through 1580s, that's when you get scientist commentary. That's when you get, oh, interesting, these descriptions in Lucretius of the symptoms of epilepsy are different from the symptom descriptions that I'm used to. I wonder whether we're conflating two different diseases, or that's when you get comments on the section where he discusses the plague, comparing the plague in ancient Athens with the symptoms of the plague, very familiar to people in the 1580s. Scientists had a different expertise from philologists. They aren't in the classics department. They're in the biology department, the medicine department, the law department. They have Latin, but they don't have mega expert Latin. And they really don't have the means to make use of this edition of Lucretius. They would struggle through this edition of Lucretius and need a dictionary a lot. But this Lucretius, they can read easily. And that's how a dozen readers becomes 300 readers, becomes 3,000 readers, becomes 30,000 readers by 1600. And that is why when we talk about what we sometimes call the scientific revolution and its connection to the rediscovery of classics in the Renaissance, it sometimes seems weird to say the classics, Lucretius rediscovered 1417, starts being a big deal in science 1615. Wasn't that 200 years? Yes. It was 200 years of people who loved the book, working really hard to make it more accessible, to make it easier, to make newer, better editions, to bring it to more classrooms, to open it up so more people could read it, eventually even producing translated versions, which open it up to yet more people. It had to transform. It had to transform over and over, because trekking through the Alps to find a manuscript is not the same thing as getting this into the edition, which will be in the books on the bookshelves of young Voltaire. But this is. Voltaire had this edition. This is the Marchetti. This is actually a translation into Italian of Lucretius, published in the very early 1600s, illegally, because it was banned by the Florentine government. Why? They didn't want it to disseminate that broadly. They made it be legal to have it in Latin, but illegal to have it in translation, because they only wanted elites to be exposed to the revolutionary ideas that they trusted elites would not want to change the world order. But they feared that vernacular readers would. And they did. This is why it's a multi-generational project, spreading the classics, so that the classics are not, remember how I said, this isn't with Petrarch the beginning of universal education, but it's the beginning of universal education. Petrarch says princes can own this, kings can own this. Cosimo de' Medici, one of the wealthiest men since Crassus of Rome, can own this, and their sons, a dozen in each city, can have the education that reared Cicero and become better people and better leaders. But he didn't know printing was coming. When printing comes and disseminates, and these books start to be everywhere, and when people notice, oh, wow, it doesn't seem to be the case that, as Plato said, only a tiny minority of people have the souls of gold, only a tiny minority of people are capable of philosophy and higher education, that a few elite philosopher prince souls, whether they are born to elites or born occasionally by chance to parents of iron or bronze, can understand Lucretius. Actually, anybody can understand Lucretius. They just have to have an education. The print revolution coming in after Petrarch, the multiplication so that by 1600, you don't have to be a king to have a library. You don't have to be in a rich capital for your city to have a library. You just have to have a dad who's maybe a lawyer to have a library, or a lawyer who lives on the street, and you can come by and say, hello, I really love to learn and I'd like to learn from your books. Will you please let me in? Okay. That is a multi-general transformation upon transformation upon transformation to produce a world that can be reshaped by the revolutionary ideas contained in a work like Lucretius. And that is what I wanted to talk about with you today. So I am delighted to linger and A, answer questions, and B, share a list of sources, and also just show you other fun things if you're interested. But that's the end of the formal talk. One fun thing real quick, I showed you this pocket Petrarch earlier. So 1600s, same as this banned Lucretius. This Petrarch is censored. It's a Baudelarized Petrarch. It was printed, censored. He has a poem about prostitutes visiting the Pope, and that has been replaced with a cleaned up poem that isn't as dirty. And the owner has pasted paper over the censored poem and written the original uncensored poem back in over it. Because every book in this period is a unique work with binding chosen by the owner and things being shared and changed by the owner. And it is just amazing to see the records and touches of these people. Where's that one? I have one here, which was the prize, the book that was the prize for the student who did the best in Greek class at his university in 1806. And here are the signatures of the rectors who gave it to him as a prize. And here's the name of the winner in the page inserted in the front. It's a Greek lexicon. It has the coat of arms of the university. This is a Netherlandish university on the front. Just every time you walk into these shops and say, do you have a book, a weird book, a book in weird condition with strange stuff pasted in it that nobody wants? And they say, yes, every one of them is a mystery and a kind of a treasure. I'll show you one more and then be excited to do questions. Yes, there are many cases of repeated notes, and I will talk about that in a second. Oh, no, this is my fake Aristotle. That's not, I mean, fake Aristotle is fun. I'll show you fake Aristotle, but it's not actually what I thought I was grabbing. Fake Aristotle. So if you want to write a work of sham science and get people to buy it, you claim that it's Aristotle. And this is one of dozens of editions of the supposed masterpiece of Aristotle, which is a book on sexual reproduction. And it pretends to be scientific and has like weird pictures of, did you know that if you have sex while thinking about evil thoughts, your baby will be born covered with fur? But in fact, a lot of it is pornography passed off as Aristotle. And it was a big hit. And the fact that it doesn't exist in Greek, that it only exists in vernacular languages, didn't get people. And I'll show you an even more fun earlier forgery. This guy, my lovely fell down an elevator shaft guy. This is the Alden edition of the letters of Marcus Aurelius. There are no letters of Marcus Aurelius. What is going on? What was going on is they didn't have Marcus Aurelius yet. It's 1500. They don't recover Marcus Aurelius for another 65, 70 years. But they know from others writing about it that there was this philosopher emperor, and that he was a Stoic, and that he did awesome philosopher king stuff. And so a clever Spanish scholar made up fake letters and an autobiography of Marcus Aurelius and claimed that it was translated from a manuscript in Florence and published it. And everyone was so excited, and there were dozens of translations into every language, and even Aldus, the Aldus, the one who was the first person to say, let's have professional Greek and Latin scholars edit our Greek and Latin works to make sure they're well edited. That was an amazing revolution. Even Aldus fell for it, or maybe didn't fall for it, but knew that it would sell. And so this is the Alden edition of the fake letters and autobiography of Marcus Aurelius. One of the other things I love about it being that the spine is all broken, so you can see the individual quires and where they were sewn together. So fakes are amazing. And when people fake classics, it teaches you so much about what they hunger for, right? What this book is a love letter to the absence of Marcus Aurelius, how desperately they wanted it back when they didn't have it yet. Tiny letters, the question of, are people reading these tiny letters? Yes, people go blind reading these tiny letters, but nonetheless, they produce them because the books are still expensive. The paper, the physical volume of the book is still the most expensive part. And I'm definitely going to have to adjust the zoom for this baby. So look at the scale. This is a Lucretius. This is the whole text of Lucretius. This is a teensy, incy, wincy pocket Lucretius. And let me get my fingertip in there to give you the scale of how small the text is. And this is intended for you to be able to slip it up your sleeve. Because they don't have pockets in their pants yet, but you can stick it up your sleeve, which is why it's so tall and narrow. I've got another pocket. Where's my pocket Valerius Maximus? I love my pocket Valerius Maximus, not just because it was my first rare book. There it is. I got it at a flea market in Florence one day. But not only is this a beautiful, tiny little pocket version of Valerius Maximus, also where you can see the spine stitching beautifully, also where somebody was testing a pen by drawing music notes on the end papers. Also, it's missing page 92, and it's been in a fire. And look, a bookworm has eaten parts of it. Yes, bookworms are real. You can see where the bookworm went all around, feasting upon the moral maxims of Valerius Maximus, which are designed for you to keep up your sleeve. So yes, they print stuff in very, very tiny text. And what letters show us is that when a scholar can't read it anymore, they have a secretary do it, right? They get an amanuensis, a person to read to them. And that is a very important but understudied element of scholarship. You know, when you buy a copy, for example, of Francis Bacon's New Organon, his response to Aristotle proposing a more empirical form of science, which is printed or published in the 1624, I think it's 1624. When you buy a Penguin paperback of that now, Francis Bacon's name is on the spine. But his amanuensis at the time, because he had mostly gone blind, who was not only reading to him but writing down as he dictated, was Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes literally wrote the words of these works of Bacon. And while Bacon is the author in the sense of being on the spine, you feel Hobbes in there, and you can see the way their ideas and their discourse and conversation as they were working were in there. All of this is so much more collaborative than we imagine. Many people creating new versions of things. You know, somebody writes a commentary, somebody else copies the most valuable bits of the commentary into a more accessible version. It's all teamwork. We had the very interesting question of how I found cases with clusters of notes repeated in different editions of the same text. Yes, and also in different manuscripts of the same text in a way that is extremely informative. And my dissertation has charts and graphs and spreadsheets in it of when the same note appears in multiple editions. It's much more common early on. One thing is that scholars are actively copying the notes of important people. So, for example, there was a poet named Marullo, a Greek emigre refugee from the fall of Constantinople who lived in Italy, was a friend of the Medici, and married Alessandra Scala, the celebrated female humanist and Greek poet, and daughter of one of the chancellors of Florence. And he was working on Lucretius when he died. When he drowned attempting to cross a river in armor on his way to fight Cesare Borgia. And he had his pocket Lucretius under his armor with him when he drowned. And scholars who had been looking forward to him someday publishing his work on Lucretius spent years tracking down all of his notes in his editions and what survived, and then copying it into others. And we have a dozen or so copies of Lucretius which say boldly on the title page, this has the notes of Marullo in it. And this edition, which I showed you, has the useful little side commentary, includes comments where this is from the notes of Marullo, this is from the notes of Marullo, even though Marullo had been dead for 60 years when this is published and had never published his own work, but the word of the fact that this had been around had spread. And so people want the notes of Marullo. But you also find people commenting on the same line because it's weird. In the manuscript period, it'll usually be vocabulary. So Lucretius has quite a bit of unusual vocabulary. One thing he uses is the verb cluere. The verb cluere is only used by Lucretius and Plautus. And it's a dreadful word. I love it. I have a whole section on it and a section of another paper on it. And it means to say or speak or shout or praise or suggest or insult by praising facetiously or publish. And when you don't know this verb and it's used in weird and confusing ways, 40% of all of our manuscripts of Lucretius have a note, chlore? What is chlore? They just all are like chlore. It's the most frequent annotation in Lucretius. Another is Lucretius uses parvissima, parvis in the superlative, and we usually say parvis can't have a superlative. It has its own special minimus, which would be the superlative. But here is Lucretius doing parvissima. And so everyone's like, parvissima, look, you can break the rule about parvis not having a superlative. And one copy in Naples, there's even an index in the flyleaf that a later scholar made of the words that the earlier scholar had copied into the margin due to their unusualness or confusion. So they're very excited to trace rare vocabulary words. The other thing they annotate a lot is just the topic. So you'll get to a description of the rites of Cybele, and they'll write Cybele or Magna Mater in the margin. You get to the description of the plague, and they'll write plague in the margin. You get to the sex scene, and they'll write Venus in huge letters down the margin. There's so much annotation on the sex scene. There are 4 manuscripts where the only annotation is on the sex scene. The sex scene and the description of the plague were definitely the 2 killer app selling points of reading Lucretius. And we have more than one manuscript where somebody just copied out the plague section. There's a medical miscellany, which somebody needs to write an article about, belonging to one of Galileo's teachers, medical scholar. And it's a collection of a whole bunch of different medical excerpts from different classics, some in Latin, some in Greek, including just the description of the plague from Lucretius. It's a really neat collection. So you do get that repeated annotation. And then in the earlier print editions, that repeated annotation becomes, here is the note in the margin. And in fact, the first edition of Lucretius, the Verona Editio Princeps, which is 15. Wow, I've actually forgotten whether it's 1576 or 1578. Amazing. Wow. Has chlore printed in the type in the margin next to where chlore is. Clearly, the person who printed it was using one of the copies where someone had marked chlore, but it's also clear that the printer realized that many readers would be excited by chlore and so wanted to preserve that oddity. And then it'll be later on that you mostly get comments on the philosophical content. Sometimes I found that the same line would have different annotation, but that same line would be frequently annotated. There's a very interesting moment when he denies the immortality of the soul, and we have 2 copies that say opinio non Christiana in the margin very angrily. Next to that one. And we also have a copy that's describing the idea of the atomic swerve, the idea that there is random motion in the motion of particles and that's where free will comes from. And we have one copy that says absurditas in sententia, ridiculous to even consider. And we have another copy that just has a bracket and an arrow, which in that copy, which has very little annotation, a bracket and an arrow is a big deal. And it doesn't criticize, it just has a bracket and an arrow, and whoever that was thought that line was pivotal. And that is Machiavelli's copy. And one of the things you learn from looking at dozens of copies side by side is, you can see the minds that are working differently. You can see this is the pattern of annotation that is totally different from the other ones. If I hadn't known that was Machiavelli, I would still have said, this copy in the Vatican, somebody is thinking very differently from his peers. He isn't marking the vocabulary. He isn't doing the philology stuff. He's marking the atomism and the physics and the question of the way motion of atoms moves. And he also really likes the passage where Lucretius says, I have written these difficult ideas in poetry to trick you into reading them, the way a doctor smears honey around the rim of a cup of bitter medicine to trick a child into drinking it, and so deceives but does not betray the child. And Machiavelli has a big bracket around that, and comp in the margin, meaning comparatio, interesting comparison. And you just see him. And there's one other copy, unknown copy, an anonymous copy in at the British Library that is as remarkable in its annotation as Machiavelli, but that one we don't know who it is. So there's two people who are annotating it in this extremely atypical way while everyone else is worrying primarily about future passive participles. Every single future passive participle is marked. They're just, what even is happening with the future passive participles? It made me feel very fond of my own struggles with them when I was a Latin student. And it's charming seeing them struggle with the stuff that is genuinely hard when they're moving to classical Latin from a form of grammatically simplified Latin. So those are what you find from the repeated patterns in annotation. And a lot can be learned about teaching practices from patterns in textbooks. Craig Callendorf, our greatest scholar of the study of Virgil in the Renaissance, has looked through thousands of copies of textbook versions of Virgil that were used in classrooms to look at patterns in what the students annotate in the margins, which tells us what readings of Virgil are being used in classrooms, how it was being read in a very pro-military and pro-imperial way, as well as a very Christianized and moralizing way. And it's that kind of discovery that lays the groundwork for, oh, interesting, their reading is different from ours. Their Aeneid is super pro-imperial. What does that tell us? That opens the way to other really neat studies. I think it's Valentina Prosperi who has the brilliant article on how Renaissance people were super uncomfortable with the Iliad. Because Petrarch held it in his hands and knew that someday Greek would be back, and they worked for generations and sailed to Constantinople and come back. And finally, Polizziano, the Homeric poet, he's one of these diamond in the rough stories. He's one of the diamond in the rough story. Oh, I will clarify, you're right. I was unclear about the role of paper in this. I skipped that. I'll go back to it in a second. Polizziano was the son of a minor bank clerk who worked for the Medici, but his father was killed in an anti-Medici riot. And so the Medici took him in and paid for his education, because the patronage network is the social safety net of this world. And he had a great head for languages, so he was raised as a scholar and translated Homer into beautiful poetry, and they read it, and it was anti-military, and it says that war is bad and peace is good, and you shouldn't constantly have your city-states fight each other. You should go home and till your fields and live in peace, and all the heroes are miserable all the time. And it made Renaissance people really uncomfortable because their society was very pro-war and pro-aggression, and so they just sort of politely stopped talking about it. And they're like, Homer, yes, everyone knows Homer is great. Here, I'll quote this description of waves from the Odyssey. I like it. It's comfortable for me, but the Iliad just sort of passes out of their discussion. They're not interested. But then the Iliad becomes popular later in anti-war moments, right? In the late Napoleonic period, when people are really tired of war, and so on. So just very briefly, and then I will stop because I know we're over time. Paper arrives in Europe in 800 AD, and they are making books on paper at that point. It is the rag paper that's made out of a mixture of whatever clothing they're using, linen, cotton. It is very, very sturdy. There's no acid in it. It lasts ages and ages. These are on paper, not on parchment. But because it's a little less sturdy than parchment, it's easier to rip. Worms eat it more easily. They're wary of it. And a good way to put it is they've had it in the West. They had it in the East for ages. They had it in the West since 800. It's 400 years, the 1200s, that we have our earliest state document on paper in Venice. They're very wary of switching over. So paper is used for note-taking, sketches, some letter writing, but even letters you want to archive. So paper is used sort of marginally for cheaper things, but it is used. If I'm looking at Lucretius manuscripts, which means they're produced between 1417 and 1515, I gotta say those dates one more time, between 1417 and 1515, half of the Lucretius manuscripts are on paper and half are on parchment. And the parchment ones are, for the most part, the more expensive, illuminated, decorated ones. And the ones on paper tend to have more annotation, have been used by scholars more because they have the cheaper copies. So paper and parchment coexist from 800 on. And the ratio changes so that you're using more paper and less parchment as people trust paper more and realize that having a cheaper writing surface is very valuable. It's still more expensive than papyrus had been, but it's much cheaper than parchment. But they coexist. And even as late as the printing of the 1630 giant commentary edition, there's one individual copy of it printed on vellum. Because if you were a duke or a duchess or a king, you would write to the publisher and say, I hear you're doing this edition. Will you make me one on parchment for my more expensive fancy library? And so there'll often be 1 or 3 or 5 copies printed on parchment, and then the rest printed on paper for elite clients versus regular clients. So parchment and paper coexist just in ratios that do this. Parchment is still used for formal correspondence by the Vatican, and we need to think of that, and also of manuscripts continuing to be produced in different ways after printing comes in, when we think of the relationship between the ebook and the paper book. Right? The ebook and the paper book are coexisting, and people are finding the different niches where each of them work better for a different purpose. And people talk about, oh, the paper book is dying. The paper book is not dying. The paper book is the cheap pocket paperback that is disposable and falls apart is dying. The well-bound, high-quality trade paperback with a beautiful cover, the hardcover with cloth and a ribbon that you're going to keep, are being printed in greater volumes and bought in greater volumes today than ever. So just as it's a good thing for paper to displace parchment as the cheap medium and parchment be used only in the cases that really need to be parchment, ebooks are displacing cheap disposable books and allowing the proliferation of high quality archive and library and collector books. And the two media are going to occupy different ecological niches and continue to thrive in parallel for hundreds of years, the same way parchment and paper did. Happy to get such great and rich questions, and my blog, exurbe.com, EXURBE, has a lot of other fun stuff. There's a post there on the Black Death and COVID and how we can understand COVID via the Black Death for those who are interested. It talks a lot about the Renaissance along the way. And if you email me, I can also send you various articles about Lucretius, etc., or the passive paraphrastic and Renaissance grammarians, if you're interested. Now we are out of time. Yes.
Actually, speaking of that, a couple of people were wondering if you could share your email address here in the Zoom chat in case they would like to ask some follow-up questions, which I'm sure several of us will have.
There it is.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Ada. This was amazing. I'm sure I can speak for everybody here in expressing my gratitude for such an illuminating talk. I believe we've basically gotten an answer to all the questions that were put in the chat already, and we're already over time, so we need to come to a close. But does anybody want to ask about anything else? Well, if not, I'm sure lots of people will have follow-ups over email. And please join me in thanking Ada Palmer for a wonderful talk once again.
Well, and in thanking the Paideia Institute for inviting it. So you guys are doing such amazing work, spreading Latin in such important ways, especially teaching post-classical Latin, which almost no one does. So thank you as well.
Thank you, Ada. And I hope we'll see each other again soon. Thanks a lot, everybody, for coming.
Thank you all.